I guess I'm the one who gets the honor of calling you all to attention. I'm Suzanne Labarge, the former Chief Risk Officer of the Royal Bank of Canada and a former Deputy Superintendent of OSFI. And I think we got a great panel today, and one of the reasons is I'm only going to give brief introductions of people because their bios are in your files. But what I do want to highlight is just how diverse the backgrounds are of various people. So we start with Stephen Hart, former Chief Risk Officer of the Bank of Nova Scotia, a bank well known to everybody here. But what I want to highlight, of course, is it's a bank that's got a lot of emerging markets exposure relative to the other two representatives here. And also, Stephen is by background an engineer before he got an MBA in finance. He's also somewhat of a typical banker in that he spent over 40 years in financial services, most with the Bank of Nova Scotia, both domestic and international, both corporate banking and risk, but adds obviously a wealth of information to the discussion today. The next person probably has the most varied background, and maybe that's the advantage of being in a smaller institution, but Susan Kudzman from Laurentian Bank, smaller bank, very domestic in its operations, but as a result she carried not only the title of Chief Risk Officer, but she was also corporate secretary, she was also head of HR, and signed off, as she said, on almost every single document the bank had to sign off on.
Compliance and legal.
Oh, I forgot compliance and legal, you're right. But Susan's also fascinating in that she's an actuary by background and has worked in consulting for pension plans. So she really brings a totally different perspective, I think, to the risk job than the other two do. And then, of course, there's Mark Hughes down at the other end, who is sat as far away from me as possible as another former risk officer. Again, RBC, again, a large bank, as you all know, but mostly, obviously, developed markets. And Mark's background reflects that. He's got a degree in finance. He's worked both in London and New York as part of it. He was in corporate bank, and not only corporate banking, but also in the investment banking side of capital markets, and was Chief Operating Officer of Capital Markets before he took over as Chief Risk Officer. So as I say, a very interesting set of backgrounds, and I hope he'll take full advantage of their being here. I'm going to start off with a couple of questions to each of them, and then hopefully throw it open to all of you, because I find that what's on your mind may be not what I thought of, given how risk has changed in the time since I've gone. So we'll start with that. And so I'm going to start with Susan and say, Susan, what did you find to be most challenging about being CRO, and what was the most rewarding?
First of all, thank you, Suzanne, for that nice introduction. I'll retain that you described me as being fascinating. I'll bring that home to my children, who are children of two actuaries and do not find us fascinating at all. So with that said, I'd open by saying it was, there's many more rewarding aspects to this job than there were challenging. There are a lot of challenging instances, and we'll probably talk about that later, but in general, the job a lot more rewarding. But there were things on the challenging side. I was quite well suited to this job by temperament, by skills, by my background. But you're really paid to worry. You're the chief worrier. And that, that you're looking for the downside, you're turning up stones. So that worry, can be draining after a long time. It's tiring, and I'm going to steal somebody else's line here that was on the phone. Now you look at the markets and you say, oh, too bad. But you're not up at night with them anymore. So I would say that a couple of my notes here is saying you're often it's fun to be positive. You want to. Everybody wants to motivate everybody and say, this is where we're going, things are going good. And again, you're often raining on somebody's parade. Not all the time, but you will now and again be that lone voice of a gloom and doom and get somewhat painted like that. And that wasn't as challenging for myself, but sometimes for your group and as a manager. You have to know your self-worth. You're not in front, you're not at the limelight, that's not your position. You're, in some way, you're a partner and you're very important, but you're not out there selling. Your successes are what you've avoided. So it's sort of, more of a challenging role to manage the younger people. On the rewarding side, there's many. I don't want to take up all the time. I'd say a couple, to me, is this very required balance of technical skills where this is my background as somewhat of a mathematician, and then always combined with that judgment and common sense, almost an overlay of one over the other. That you can't really, you need both of them. You really, truly do need that, and that again was very rewarding. The breadth of what you see. We went from, we all came up through one stream, be it credit, be it, modeling for me, but you end up having to learn. It's your job to be curious, to ask questions. So you're always learning about something, from a CDO square to, now the things we're learning about technology that weren't always necessarily in our wheelhouse. So the things you learn about your institution. You have a really wide view of everything. I'd say the role, and we'll talk about that later, became more and more important. So you became a very key member of an executive team. You had direct contact with regulators, shareholders, your board. So that's always, an interesting place to be. And I'd finish off by saying that when the partnership worked a second line with the front line, and everybody understood their role and viewed risk as a resource, it's a very powerful partnership and was, I'd say, the ultimate rewarding part of the job.
Stephen, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I would say definitely over the last 10 to 15 years, the role of the Chief Risk Officer has really developed and evolved. At one point earlier, I heard quite a few people in my own banks that they say credit was the speed bump on the way to their bonus. And I think we've gotten past that, although I still got one or two in the investment banking side of that. But what really developed over time is that the risk manager went from being Dr. No all the time to the guy that's now part of the strategy. We were all on the top operating committee of the bank. So all the decisions, not just risk decisions, investment decisions, strategic acquisitions, everything that the bank was going forward on, changing of the culture, which is very key, was something that I was involved in, and I think that's true for all of us. And I think that developed, good news or bad news, because of the financial crisis. The authorities just wanted to make sure that risk was always signing off, and they kept coming up with new risks all the time. There were occasions that I was sitting there trying to figure out what strategic risk was, but we worked that out. But it definitely has been an evolution, and I think no longer being Dr. No made it really a progression for me. I would say, to Susan's point, you start to take the job home. So my family would always be looking at me going, why is he always so negative? Like we're on a road trip and I'm waiting for the tire to blow, sort of stuff. And always looking for options. You're in the hotel room and you're sitting there going, okay, the fire exits are there. But now it's been a year since I've been retired, and I'd like to say that I'm a nicer, kinder person. I'll just leave it at that.
Mark, how could I pass up asking you exactly the same thing?
Well, the one aspect of challenge that I found when I took on the role was the analyst call, the earnings call. I found, obviously hadn't done that in any previous of the roles of over 30 odd years, and the tension, if you like, of being asked a question on the analyst call when potentially if you screw it up, the share price could actually go down, and so that certainly created a bit of headache. You go home on the weekend before with a 3 or 4 inch binder, so you felt like you were back at university or school again having to study, because the question could be on almost anything, and you had to really sort of know the bank, not just the sort of risks that were the risks of the day, but what does this number on page 44 of your supplement actually mean, and trying to sort of deal with that. In terms of the rewarding side, I would touch on, I won't necessarily call the rest of us, but it's certainly in my case, I'm one of the older guys, not necessarily used to as much technology with the young folks. And what we did bring in the last couple of years when I was there, and is going on now, is quite a bit of a focus on innovation. And the motivation that we managed to get out of some of our new employees, younger employees, trying to figure out how they can bring technology and innovation to risk management was a joy to behold. The energy that these people bring and the excitement that they can bring when they think of something So I was really very, very proud of the team that brought that forward.
Great. Well, while I've got you, Mark, maybe you could talk about what was the hardest decision or issue you had to deal with as Chief Risk Officer, and looking back, would you have done anything differently?
Well, as Stephen kept sort of talking about Dr. No, that sort of comes to mind, because I think any time that you really have to say no, because there are moments when you do have to say we're not going to do something, is very hard. And it's even more doubly hard when you're saying no, but it appears that another financial institution is saying yes. And so without maybe touching on clients or transactions for confidentiality reasons, I will just mention two examples. One is leverage lending and one is AML and KYC. Leverage lending I find amusing because actually, Suzanne, I remember when you were CRO, your love of leverage lending and coming to see you with Chuck Winograd suggesting we might even do one leverage loan deal, to which you said no, to now actually there being a fairly substantial industry of this. So life has moved on quite a bit. But when the OCC and the Fed in the US came out with their guidance on leverage lending a few years ago, we at RBC introduced that as a global standard. And we stuck to it, and we still stick to it. But there are a number of institutions out there who do not. And so we've had to turn down, during my time, some transactions that others were doing. And that's really very challenging. Would I do it again? Absolutely, because I think we totally bought into the standards that we agreed to. Everybody agreed that that was our risk appetite at the time, and you're not going to necessarily bend just for the sake of one transaction for running regulatory risk on the opposite side. KYC AML is another example of that. There's a lot of, it's evolved a lot over the years, particularly in, say, the wealth management area. There's a lot of clients in Europe and Asia where source of wealth can be a little bit debatable. And again, if they're banked by someone else, it's sort of a question, why can't we do that? Well, again, I think reputation risk has to sort of be taken into account versus one transaction or one particular client. So on those occasions, we've said no, I would do them again. But in terms of tension and challenge within the organization, it's really those times when you do have to stick to the discipline, stick to the risk appetite. You certainly hope you can find solutions. You hope you can find workarounds. I think that is definitely a difference between a risk manager today and a risk manager of the past. I mean, I remember, again, at RBC, you remember Al Channel probably from our days. We had a vice president in risk at the time. If you want an answer now, the answer is no. If you want to wait for a couple days, it's a maybe. So it's, that's sort of the philosophy that it used to be, 20 years ago. Today, that's not the way it is, but there are still moments when you might still have to say no.
Stephen, anything to add?
Yeah, probably the major regret that I have, the hardest thing, is the fact that we spent hundreds of millions of dollars to create a data system that was being pressured for ARDAR, and there was an artificial time frame that was set up for that. And I think that kind of pushed all the banks into throwing a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of energy into something that was trying to take pretty good, like 95, I can get 95% of the data on a client within an hour, and I can get 100% within a day. Going from 95% to 100% cost a huge amount of money and time and effort and stress. And probably if I had to do it again, I'd push back against the regulators and do it in a modular format. I mean, the stuff that we do now in the digital factory at Scotia on the innovation side, you chop it into smaller groups of data projects, and you have that continuous feedback. That would be a much better way to approach it than the big bang theory that we did.
Susan.
I guess each one of us can think back to individual situations. I was also the chief risk officer at the Caisse de dépôt during the commercial paper crisis as well as the financial crisis. So I remember distinctly, I'll never forget having a very lengthy conversation about a macro hedge in 2007 that, okay, well, maybe not. So that's one I'd do over again. But I think I brought to each situation a positive attitude, looking for a solution, trying to use risk as the resource, a risk budget, and having the character, I guess, and the courage sometimes to stand alone, and when it really wasn't the right thing to do, to try to push back. And I've had a lot of support, so it's usually if you choose it, with parsimony when you really say those no's. But I've always been supported, and so the regrets are on individual circumstances that you can't get them all right. We all got a lot right, and there's some we missed, but there's just no way. Our batting average, I'm sure, is pretty good.
I'm going to ask one question that the audience is going to ask, so I think I'm going to beat you all to it, which is the question that is, all right, what do you think should be keeping the chief risk officer up at night, since it doesn't have to keep you up? But everybody, I mean, you never lose your feel for looking at it. Yeah. So I'd be really curious, and Stephen, why don't you start on this? If you look at it, how would you, what would be worrying you? I mean, you haven't been gone long, so you.
Yeah, well, I mean, you always got that question, is what keeps you up at night?
Yep.
And I always replied, I sleep like a baby, but then I drink to excess every night. It's a compromise. But I mean, I always found that you can only worry about the stuff that you can do something about. And cyber just, it's this, and it's still this big, huge blank area. I mean, I can diversify credit risk, I can diversify liquidity, I can diversify market risk, I can do all sorts of stuff with operational risk. You can't diversify cyber risk, because one hit can hit you for $1.50 or it can hit you for 1.5 billion. And there's absolutely no way, and you go to your experts, and your experts sit there and say, we have 7 walls of defense. And I'm sitting there going, I'm the engineer going, okay, how high is the wall? How about 8? Can we have 8 walls? And they look at me like, no, you don't get it. And I'm sitting there going, no, I really, we don't get it, sort of stuff. So now, I mean, I know there was an earlier version. We have been hacked. I mean, we get hacked every day. We know that. And all we're trying to do now is reroute them into dark corners so they can't hurt us, sort of stuff. So it's still probably the biggest issue, just because. And the technology, I mean, I think we've all gone off to Israel to chat with them, because they have probably the best cyber attack technology in the world, sort of stuff. And that's what you've got to do. It's just, you got to handle it as best you can with the skill set you've got.
Susan?
Well, I think, I won't repeat that, and probably everybody in this room. One thing I would say, I just wish I could have not worried about the things I couldn't control, because I just really worried about everything. Things I could control, I couldn't. But cyber is definitely, top of mind. I'm just retired 7 weeks in now, so it's all still quite fresh. So cyber, macro, and I'll leave it to my colleagues from the larger banks. But I guess also, since I moved around and was with, the case was very large, but different kinds of institutions. There was also, each institution has its own specific weaknesses that sometimes when you're new in a chair, this is when they will surface. So there is an advantage now and again to have, changing people. So those are particularly, everything's worrisome, but those also because you're alone. Some of the others you can share information, and push comes to shove, you say we're all going down together. Whereas your own thing is, sat very heavy on my shoulders. And there were various forms of them. As I mentioned, the commercial paper was very, very big issue at the case. Laurentian Bank, most of you will know, we went through a difficult period last year. Again, securitization, structured products, is something I stay away from if I can. Now, and so when you're alone and you're small and you have less resources, that I would say was one of my top risks also, with the other big stuff.
Mark?
Well, certainly cyber, as I think we had at Richard's little survey at lunchtime, came top of that. I'm sure it'll come top of every survey that's done around, so won't go on that a bit more. I think just because maybe to echo sort of Stephen's flat tire analogy, as risk officers, you always worry about this is a benign environment, or it seems to be a benign environment at the moment, benign credit, benign markets maybe. So you're always looking around the corner, something bad is going to happen. It's just, what is it? And when you don't know what things are, that's sort of what you worry about. So you try to look at your portfolios, you try to look at, do we have any asset concentrations? Do we have any asset bubbles? That sort of thing. So I would certainly worry about that. I'm not sure it would keep me up at night, but I certainly would be trying to focus some attention on that. And then one of the benefits, I think, of being CRO is you're part of the executive team, and that then brings strategic risk to the forefront. You're no longer just doing credit transactions, or you're no longer just doing market risk. And what I mean by strategic risk is all of the banks, every institution is around growth and trying to achieve growth. And in a relatively low interest rate environment, relatively low GDP growth environment, how do you achieve growth? Do you sort of go to different countries or expand in different countries, or do you take on more risk? Do you go down the risk curve? And I do tend to find over the 30-odd years, the business guys sort of find that's the way they would like to go, is to go down the risk curve, or to take more risk, or to take, increase the concentration of a portfolio. So I do find making sure that if we are going to be taking on risk as an institution, we decide to do it strategically, we apply it in terms of a risk appetite, and then if something does actually go wrong, something goes wrong, but at least it was a conscious decision, as opposed to, everybody does a transaction and then you wake up the next morning or 2 or 3 weeks from now and then you find that you've suddenly got a whole pile of transactions you didn't quite realize. So I think focusing on the strategic side was something that really I found quite invigorating, if you like, as being CRO.
A question, just there's
Popped your
a
mind?
lovely. This is one that's not even I haven't even told you guys about. There's a lovely quote that I like from Warren Buffett that says, because banks are often referred to as lemmings. I mean, everybody goes in the same directions, and it says, lemmings get a really bad reputation. It says, but the advantage of lemmings is that if everybody's going that way, as he says, lemmings have a very bad reputation, but you've never heard of a single lemming being criticized. All right? And the view is, as long as everybody's doing it and makes the same mistake, you're okay. And I'd recently read an article that says with the regulatory environment now and the kind of perspective that's being done, that banks are becoming, in some ways, more uniform because it's easier to judge people against the same thing. Are you seeing that? Is that just somebody's hypothesis out there that doesn't carry through? And is there a tendency of trying to force people into more standardized ways of doing things or of measuring risk, not allowing for a divergence of perspectives? Mark, I'll let you take that one first.
I can think of it from two directions, I guess. One, I think the Canadian banks themselves, or at least the big five, I suppose, or six, if you went back 20 years or whatever, they all looked exactly the same pretty much. There is quite a divergence today of the strategies. So there has been, as you noted with Scotia, a much more of a Latin America, emerging markets type of focus, RBC, USA, TD USA, but TD more retail. So I think the Canadian banks have sort of gone on slightly different paths to achieve their growth. So there is a difference there. But where I would agree with you is the regulatory environment is pushing us all together. So from a capital perspective, from a liquidity perspective, from a leverage perspective, it is pushing us there. I would say I also worry a little bit about sort of Basel IV in a sense, or Basel III or whatever it's called, in a sense of where some of these things like operational risk is being pushed back towards standardized. Because again, that I think will probably push us a lot closer together in terms of how we're managing some of these risks. Whereas if you did have your models and you had the ability to be a little bit more unique in terms of how you manage your own risks versus others, it would help. But where that's going to go, I don't quite know. But I think strategically the Canadian banks were different, but I would totally get your point on the regulatory world.
Stephen, I want to save Susan for the last on this one. There's a reason for that. So Stephen.
Yeah, no, I totally. I mean, everything that was coming out of Basel was pushing us to standardize. So you're already. I mean, they're already telling you they don't want your internal risk models to be any different than anybody else. OSFI had a lot of issues with us because, as noted, we're a little different. We're down in Latin America. They came up with one stress test a couple of years ago, specifically, and they do all the stress tests. Unemployment goes up, interest rates go up, delinquencies increase, and then this one had, and 3 Latin American countries default. I go, that sounds a little specific. Who else has any exposure to Latin America? So, but that was the kind of, and they kind of indicate to like to push you back into the mold because it's easy for them to then compass all sort of thing. So, and I think I found internationally the same thing was happening there as well. So there is a push. Having said that, you know what? And CMHC just did it in the Globe Mail today. I was reading, which I said, that's too bad. But they did their stress tests and they don't break. When we've done our stress tests and they're really pushing us to do this stuff, and you can't break a Canadian bank on a credit issue. So, in order to do the stress management plans and actually create a credible threat to the Canadian banking system, you have to go to cyber.
Yeah.
There's no other way to break us.
Susan, as a representative of a smaller bank, how much more freedom do you have, or do you have less by virtue of being small?
Well, I have two viewpoints that will answer your question because I came from the investment world, where we had complete freedom. And I found useful to have a regulator, not only at the beginning, because it's additional someone to lean on, or in certain circumstances blame. However, Mark's comment that we had so little latitude in doing your own modeling, or you're being pushed into, and as a small institution, this is part of our challenge. We remained a chartered bank with all the same services in one geography, but we were subject to all these same B10, B20. We're moving to advanced methodology, right smack in the middle of that. So I would say not at all. We had, if anything, and because I guess I'm a former, I can say a couple of things here, is that I think we worried the regulators more than a large bank, which I think there's a basis to that also. But no, we did not have more latitude in any way.
I did have one interaction with a regulator, a regulator, I won't say which one, that was quite amusing because I had a presentation that we gave to the board that was listing risks that I perceived that RBC was facing. And one of them I actually put down was regulatory risk. Mm-hmm. And the regulator in question certainly did not like the idea that they were causing risk.
I have a big red on mine. There's a big red circle on ours.
Which it seems to me is a perfectly appropriate time to open it up to questions from the floor. So I don't know if there's anybody and what the process is for getting them out here.
There are mics around if someone has a question.
Hands have to go up.
Any hands up here? Or
Over there.
up? I think we've got.
Hi, Rachel Ginzo from OPB. I have a question related to both cyber and regulatory. You mentioned both. One of the frustrations in the banks, anyway, is that on the cyber front, the regulatory questions are not consistent. It's never the same question twice. So do you envision that any time the regulators will eventually get to the same place and have a more consistent and easier way for everyone to answer those regulatory questions? Because it's, as everybody knows, it takes a lot of time. There's a lot of exercise involved over and over again, answering almost the same but not quite the same questions. What do you foresee in that area?
Let me get that. So a couple things I would say. First one is I was actually quite heartened by this morning, and that's why I jumped in, because I'm not sure it was Stephen, I don't think was here. Suzanne, you weren't here, you were here. But the presentation we had from the cyber folks this morning, I actually found quite heartening, because at least it did seem that on a Canadian context, there was some effort to try to pull Canada, at least at the governmental level, together. Because I think the Canadian banks have been pushing over the last few years to get Ottawa to try to actually organize around this, because the banks can't talk to each other, or it's very hard to talk to each other. As you say, there's a difference in terms of questions and examinations, et cetera. So I was actually reasonably pleased. I did actually go on the website of the thing that started on the 1st, and it does look like it's a good step forward from a Canada perspective. With respect to the questions, the way we used to do it at RBC is the US issues tend to be the hardest, so particularly in New York State, which is where RBC is. And so we tended to use that as the high water mark, and so we tried to answer all those questions, and then we tended to find that they can be in some way used to answer everybody else's questions. Whereas if you started, say, with the Canadian ones or another country's ones, they weren't good enough to answer in the US. So it was just trying to get to the hardest level of regulatory examination and then work backwards. It still didn't mean we had to do a lot of work to try to sort of mold them into the answers that each individual regulator was looking for. But that's how we tried to deal with the problem that you've obviously experienced as well. I certainly see in the US or in the UK in particular a lot more coordination between banks and the government in terms of how things work. There does seem to be an effort here to try to get that organized, but I think more can be done compared to what I see in other countries. Does that help?
Do either of you want to add, or should we open up for another? Oh, we've got another question here.
Since you're all retired now, I feel okay to ask this question. What do you think board risk committees can and should do to help a CRO do his job well?
Stephen?
Well, I've got some guy, at least I had, some guy called Tiff, who was chair of my risk committee, that he came in just as I was leaving, nothing personal. And I found that and I'll go back, when I first started presenting to the risk committee, was probably 20 years ago, under like 4 CROs prior. And it was a different experience. And I think that's true for all boards. Boards got stuck with like 3 pounds of paper the day before or the day of the meeting. They hadn't read anything. They asked questions that were kind of high level and didn't really care what the answer was, sort of thing. And what we found over the last 10, 15 years, obviously the crisis, and it goes back to like 2000. I mean, Enron started the whole thing, and we started redoing everything we did, how we presented information. We can now present it electronically. They all got it on their iPad a week and a half before, but you're still giving them. I mean, we did a survey a couple of years ago. I mean, there's like 300 pages that I sent to the risk committee of the board on a monthly basis, sort of stuff. And we started segmenting to, this is the structural stuff. These are the policies and procedures that we have to send to you, and they're in the 3rd tier sort of stuff. This is the stuff that we think is a little interesting, but here's the real. So we started segmenting for them, and they kept wanting, and the feedback was that, tell us what we should be focused on, and I found increasingly. They really became a positive force, and then all of a sudden they're starting to walk into my office on non-board days, and I'm sitting there going, hello, and it's kind of, we started giving seminars to them. They started asking more questions. You start getting phone calls, as I say, when it's a non-board issue sort of stuff. So I think the responsiveness of the boards these days and the educational level has really gone up. The best thing that they can do is we have there's always a little session after the board meeting, after the risk committee, where all the other executives leave, and it's just the CRO and the board members. And then, you know, you can ask the questions that I can't answer in front of the CEO, who immediately asks me after I get out, so what did they say? And it's never, you know, there's never any, oh, like there's a secret or anything like that. But it just opens up a broader, more congenial a two-way conversation, as opposed to me just downloading data on them, sort of stuff.
I guess, you know, some of the same. I'd say for risk committee members, make sure you have a strong, competent, and courageous CRO that can stand up when required, be that lone voice. Then support him or her. There's some literature out there that there should be, you know, direct reporting relationship to the risk committee. I don't personally believe that that's the way to go. I think the way to go is to have that open communication and the opportunities, as I've always had, and the support to speak to the risk committee. The direct reporting relationship, I think, will pull you out of the bank, out of your organization, set you a little bit to the side, resemble a little bit, or you know, a little bit of being less part of the executive team of the teams. That's been my feelings on it. Ask questions, and there's a lot of the literature also is more and more having specific technical competencies on your risk committee also, either getting them through training or recruiting people. You don't have to have a full risk committee of ex-modelers or et cetera, but somebody there that can pick up the jargon and go through those pieces that no matter how we try to make it simple, there's some stuff in there that's, and in our day-to-day job, we're busy, so we don't have time to just always really make it perfect.
Again, two observations. I think one is I think the regulators are causing still a bit of confusion here, because there's this sort of divergence between they don't really want the committees of the board or the board to actually manage the company, but on the other hand, they still actually want the committees and the board to be, you know, knee deep in actually what's sort of going on, and it's very difficult to figure out how you balance that. What we tried to do, I think, at RBC over the time that I was there, when I started the risk committee, we had at the beginning a 5-minute intro period where I would just sort of highlight a couple things, and then we'd get into this massive paper that everybody still has. By the time I left or retired, we had devoted, it was now up to about an hour of essentially just verbal conversation. So what I would do, so the 5 minutes expanded to an hour, and that sort of shrunk the time that we were dealing with all the paperwork. And what we talked about in that hour was essentially the topics of the day. So, because the problem with some of the paperwork is you prepare it, it takes weeks to prepare, you've got all these presentations, et cetera, and something could have happened yesterday, or they read it in Globe and Mail 2 days ago or whatever. And so let's just say, for the sake of argument, today would have been an RBC Risk Committee day. We would have spent time in that hour talking about the US-Canadian treaty. What does that mean? Is that good, bad, or indifferent? We wouldn't have had any presentation on it, and we were finding that the risk committee really liked that, because it was actually getting into what they felt was the topics of the day. They spent some time on the paper, and you still had to go through all of that stuff, but it was a big change. The last thing I would say is it's maybe some of I guess what makes a good risk manager is our heading. What we found when I took over, and what we found when we were talking about the person replacing me, is a good CRO these days has to be someone who can actually explain to a board or a risk committee risks in a very simple way. Because if you actually have to take, you know, 30 pages of a presentation to explain stuff, it won't work. You have to be able to take it, explain it in simple words, because they're all different backgrounds, they're not risk managers, and make them understand what is the risk and what are we doing about it. And so that communication skill, I'm not sure whether it was necessarily different in the past, but it's definitely a skill you need today.
Yeah, I'm going to, as somebody, I've been on 2 bank risk committees, an insurance risk committee, as well as CRO, so I have both perspectives. Mark's comment, I think, is a very true one. I always felt as CRO that one of my jobs was to translate, to take bank jargon and put it into business jargon. And it's very interesting when you get your staff doing it, you actually find out they really don't understand what they're doing as much as they think they do. And so it's actually very good from a banker's perspective to actually have to do it. But it also allows a risk committee member to ask far more intelligent questions, because a senior business person knows business really well, knows what's going on. but they can get baffled by the jargon. And if you want to be baffled by the jargon, try an insurance company. All right? And so trying to get down to get people to talk to you in language you can understand allows that dialogue that Mark is talking about on both sides. And it makes all the difference in terms of a board member being able to feel they can contribute well to the committee, all right? And I mean, my lovely story is when I was CRO, long before Mark, is we would try and do a presentation with the head of the business making a presentation about what the business was, and the risk manager there to talk about what the risks were and how they were managed. And all I remember vividly is after one of our New York people being there, as we're leaving, the chair of the risk committee pulls me aside and says, Suzanne, make sure you don't give him any more leeway. You know, it was really good. They could see who the players were, and that, I think, too, gives them a sense of comfort, or in some cases, discomfort, with what's going on, as just, instead of having the CRO always being front and center and the only one there. So I would add that. Any other questions here?
Thank you. Nuwan Mahmood from Canada Pension Plan Investment Board. I have an intriguing question for you. So what makes a good risk manager?
All right, Stephen, you start.
I mean, a good risk manager is someone who we said before is willing to say no, but more importantly is willing to figure out how to get to yes. And I think that was, I mean, Mark said it earlier, I mean, if you want a quick answer, it's no. And that was kind of the philosophy. And as I said earlier, I mean, credit was considered a barrier to get the deal done. I think what we found over time is, I mean, we all came from, I mean, I came from the banking side, so, and I made sure that all my senior VPs that were in risk all had field experience. So you've been to a client, you've had to say no to a client, so it's a little bit more empathy for the banker when he spent all this time to try to develop a deal, or someone structured something together to walk them through what are the risks. So I think you have to have empathy for the banking side. They are the first line of defense, and that's really what I used to tell all the people when I was traveling around the world in all our locations, mainly in Latin America. There's 88,000 risk managers at the Bank of Nova Scotia. And that's the message that we continue to push. There's a reason why we call it the first line of defense, sort of stuff. And I had the most interesting conversations with frontline people who didn't think they had any risk in their business. And these, I mean, we're talking, you know, tellers, we're talking wealth management, and you walk them through. Maybe it's not a credit risk, but maybe it's an operational risk, and and you walk them through, and all of a sudden the light goes on, sort of thing. So I think someone who can be balanced, try to get to yes, because at the end of the day, the client is the key issue. I'm there first for the client, second for the bank, and third for myself.
I'm looking here at my notes, and you know, a lot has already been said, and I think that's good. It's consistent. So, you know, if I jot down the bullet points here. So technical skills are a base. You will need some in one field somewhere, and you can learn the others, but you're starting with some technical skills, and there's more. We're looking a little bit more for technology now and operational risk. That's where the things are most probably going to happen, and where I think a lot of our energy and effort is being focused at this point. Communication, we talked about that. It is key. I had this little test when we have the, you know, you're hiring the physicists or the mathematicians, and I'd have them sit and explain to the rest of the group, before they were hired, try to explain to me in 15 minutes what your thesis was about. And it was quite enlightening. If they could even get, you never understood for real, but you could at least, you know, get a feeling if.
Don't put them in front of the risk committee then.
No, but if this person would be able to translate things. I had one couldn't do it because he says this is classified. I said, well, okay. So back to the technical skills. So communication is key, because no matter what you do, if you can't translate it to anybody and, you know, be able to say in 5 minutes what are the top 3 things, et cetera. The judgment, the common sense, talked about that you're working with your technical skills, but with that judgment and common sense, you'll be in situations where all your models don't mean anything. September 10 years ago, in the middle of the night, what did your liquidity models mean? They meant nothing. So you had to use some common sense, people around the table. And that brings me, I guess, to one of the last ones is, I've mentioned it a couple of times, there will be very rare instances, but you're going to need to have strong character and the courage to stand up and not always say no, but at least raise those very unpopular issues at times, which isn't always fun, with a lot of strong-minded egos and people, and very successful people around the table that want to do things. And so it's not about saying no, but being the one that can stand up and raise the unpopular issues. And you can't find that sometimes all in the same person, but you can try looking for it for sure.
I'd maybe agree with all of what Stephen and Susan have said. To maybe connect on some of them, on the Stephen's point about getting to yes, the way I used to phrase it at RBC is that the business of banking is essentially taking risk. I mean, if you actually think about what banks are, that's what we do. We take deposits and we lend them out with the idea that we're going to get the money back, so you're taking on risk. If you don't take on risk, so if you actually say no all the time, you're out of business. So we tried to sort of at least get a philosophy through risk management that we are in the business of taking risk. We're not eliminating risk. We might want to mitigate it, but we do have to take risk. But maybe to pick on the judgment point, you also at times had to get the business guys to actually understand the risk-return equation. Because to a business guy, every deal is a good deal. But there are times when the return is not enough to cover the risk that you're actually taking. So there have been a number of instances, even when I was actually on the business side, where we would actually talk about the risk and return equation, and risk management didn't have to say no. The business actually ended up saying no, or they would go back to the client and say, we need more return. We'll do this. And so we got to a yes, because if the return's better, that justifies the risk, and we're in the business of taking risk. But if you're not getting paid for the risk, then it was an issue. Another way, and I think it might have been in actually the article that Richard mentioned that I wrote, I do think a good risk manager is someone who spent time in business, and I think a good business person is somebody who spent time in risk management. So I was certainly very active dialogue with the HR department at RBC to try to make sure that we actually had a lot of cross-fertilization between the business and risk management. Now that's harder to do with specialization these days, whether it's a specialization on the business side or specialization on the risk management side. It's a lot easier when people are more junior in their careers or starting out, but that means a lot more planning. People need to plan, and you need to somehow say to a young person who wants to be an investment banker, spend some time in risk management. It's not necessarily what their mindset would be, and you have to convince them that it's actually truly going to be good for their career, even if they go back to being an investment banker. So I do think what makes a good risk manager is somebody who's had the time in some business. And I guess the last point is maybe sums all that up, is one of collaboration. And I do think it is one of the examples of why, one of the reasons why I think the Canadian banks have done so well over the years is I do really see between the leadership of the Canadian banks, all of the Canadian banks, a great collaboration between the business and risk management. We're not adversaries. Sometimes there's a no, sometimes we'll get to yes, whatever. But truly it is a team approach and a bit of a collegial approach as to how we get there. What I've seen in some of the international organizations, they're not. Now maybe it's because we've been in the banks for so long. I was at RBC for 37 years. Stephen, I don't know how much you were. Suzanne, you were there for quite a while. I mean, maybe that's how you get to it. I don't know, because the business guys were there equally as long too, whereas in some of these international banks, they do move around. I don't know if that's the answer, but I certainly find, you really want to be a team, business and risk, not adversaries.
Yeah, I think that's where we were going before. I mean, risk is everybody's business, and so the same thing. I mean, the business guys we had a credit committee originally that was just the risk guys getting together and chatting about the credit. That was sent by paper, and that morphed over time to the credit committee consisted of both senior VPs of banking and credit. And in fact, you could not sign off on a deal unless you had people from both sides signing off on it. So the signature system was such that a senior VP or a VP in banking had to sign off, and that therefore was his or her deal, sort of stuff. So suddenly it's not throwing the stuff over the transit and hoping that credit will sign off, and if they do, whew, it's their problem. But it really makes it a collegial kind of effort.
I'm going to add one characteristic that nobody here has mentioned that I found the best chief risk officers had, and that's what I call his intellectual curiosity. They're ones who can look broadly across the world and see trends, see things that otherwise aren't connected. They're interested in the world in general and not just an industry or a credit. Those guys make really good chief risk credit officers, but they don't get above a credit. And so if you're going to be doing risk broadly, you've got to be able to think much more broadly than just your institution as being like, if you're being asked about NAFTA, you know, you have to have a general knowledge of what's going on in the world, how it all ties together, and what risks might be coming out of that to give yourself just a head start to think about things. And I would throw that in as a characteristic that I think a really, really good chief risk officer has.
Yeah, second order aspects. I mean, it's easy to see something when it hits, but then you have to look at how the second and third orders are and how that's going to affect. And the things that we found in a couple of crises is that, you know, a lot of stuff correlates. You think there's no correlation, whoops, it all goes to one.
You know, and having been through crises is something that's
That's
useful.
experience.
You know,
We
and
don't wish that on people.
No,
though.
we don't. But you know, it tempers the.
It's useful.
It is.
Is there a question over here?
You have talked about the change of regulatory environment and rapid technology advance, but those are external factors. Can you also talk about internal factors in terms of the involvement of the risk culture in your organizations? For example, the efforts have been made to shape or define the risk culture in your organizations.
Well, I think, you know, and I'll speak for my experiences, and it sort of ties in with the last comment. You never waste a good crisis. Eh? So since the financial crisis and the various events that, you know, I lived through the commercial paper which preceded, et cetera. And all, you know, the regulation, yes, is external, but it's all sort of, it all sort of bubbled up from, you know, the scars and the trauma of that financial crisis. And I dare say in the organizations I was in, the risk culture was strengthened. There was the role of the risk managers had a lot more space, a lot more latitude, a lot more support, and that, you know, is part of. And most organizations undertook a formal process of addressing culture. Culture doesn't, you know, is changed by actions and by leadership and by role models, but it's also can be changed by, you know, different programs and policies, et cetera. So I would say most organizations upped the risk culture and got us to a place where we do have a lot of front lines that are very conscious of it and view it as they're the drivers in the car, you know, where maybe the police officers stopping or the judges, but that they are driving that they are the first line and they have the most impact on it. And you know, it's variable depending on the organization and the type of group, but I would venture and be, you know, pretty confident to say that all the first lines are have progressed immensely over the past 10 years.
I think risk culture is something that the Canadian banks have actually been good at, and I think it is, again, a bit of a differentiator between us around the world. Maybe it's, again, my point about that people have been in these organizations for a long time. I know the phrase around RBC is that we all bleed Royal Bank blue. So that maybe it's Stephen's point that he's got 80,000 risk managers. We all think, you know, within RBC, we think that way. It has changed and amplified over time. Crisis changes. I remember after Enron, we created a structured transaction committee where we looked at anything that we were doing. I think, Suzanne, you actually instituted that, didn't you? You know, anything that looked strange. Anybody could put it forward. That's now morphed into a reputation risk committee, which anyone in the organization can refer a transaction or a way we're doing something to this particular committee if they think we should be doing something differently. There's a lot of now, the compensation schemes are all different. There's clawbacks, there's deferrals. I mean, that again came out of the last crisis. So there's a lot there, but I do think the Canadian banks do generally tend to feel the culture is a very strong one. I know I was actually at one of the breaks, I was talking to one of the folks here, he's from the Globe and Mail. One of the things we talk about at RBC is what's the Globe and Mail test? Is something we do, is it going to be in the Globe and Mail tomorrow? And if it is, do we really want to be doing it? Because that's not the sort of reputation reputation, I can't remember whose quote it is, but you can, it takes a long time to earn, it's incredibly valuable, and you can lose it really fast, and that's pounded away at us over the years. So we value our reputation a lot. I mean, that doesn't mean out of 80,000 people, somebody might not do something wrong, but the culture, I think, at least at RBC, and I think across all the Canadian banks, is pretty strong.
Yeah, I made everybody watch the video of the Wells Fargo Senate hearings and the CEO getting just lacerated and really telling him that, you don't want us in that position, sort of thing.
You asked about the risk committee, by the way. Last year, Wells Fargo risk committee met 54 times between meetings and telephone calls. So there you go.
And since I notice we've run out of time, I'm going to make the one last comment. One thing I've learned about being either on a risk committee or CRO is the one thing you realize is how much leadership counts. Risk cannot be supply driven. You can give management all the information, but if the top person, having been on the board of Deutsche Bank, I can speak with great authority. If the top person doesn't want it, doesn't care, and gives a different message, you don't have a risk culture in the organization, no matter how good your CRO is. And so I just ended it. It is one of all of those ones, but leadership does matter. And on that note, I thank you all very much, and I think thank you, panelists. It's wonderful.
Thank you very much to Suzanne in that final panel. I certainly, enjoyed that very much. I'm going to repeat something Richard said earlier, which is that at GRI we have a mission, and that mission is to be the premier organization that defines thought leadership and risk management globally. And we bring together leaders in industry, academia, and government to draw actionable insights on emerging risks. I think it's fair to say that today's conference is a giant step forward in GRI, accomplishing what was really set out as a lofty mission almost 10 years ago in the wake of the financial crisis. To our speakers, panelists, moderators, thank you for your contribution to a tremendously interesting and thought-provoking day. I also would like to thank our sponsors again, Deloitte, Promontory, DBRS, and the Rotman School of Business. Without their support, conferences like this wouldn't happen. There's also another group of people I'd like to thank, that Richard and I would like to thank, which is to recognize the people who do all the heavy lifting behind the scenes to make sure that things run smoothly, that we get fed well, and that is from GRI, Karen Tam and her team, Maria Montez, Joel Parson, Denise Robinson, and Bernadette Fernandez. Please join me in thanking them. So as you know, or at least you should now know, GRI chooses themes, and they guide our work. Richard did a Slido survey over lunch and asked the question about what risks you see affecting the industry over the next 24 months. I'd like to do that again, but I'm going to change the question slightly with a slight twist. And so now I would like you to take out your devices, please. And vote again. This time, though, it's not what you think is going to affect the industry. This is what's going to affect your organization specifically over the next 24 months. Perhaps it's based on some of the things you've heard today, and perhaps it's just based on what you know is coming at us. But if you would please vote now, this is very helpful to informing our work here at GRI. Okay, great. Very interesting. Well, thank you all for voting, and we're going to take that feedback. I mean, clearly cyber continues to be important, although it's interesting to watch industry disruption and opportunities in fintech. Oh, there it goes, like a horse race. So this will really help us focus our work on the issues that are important to you, our friends. While I have the podium, I'd like to highlight a couple of other events and upcoming things we're doing with GRI to help engage with our membership. Richard talked about the education front. We are taking our board risk oversight and insight program on the road to Montreal. Those of you that have board directors or executives with board reporting responsibilities, it's an excellent time to build with a cohort of great people and spend a day thinking about risks. So we have a few spots available left there, and we also have a couple spots left on November 27th and 28th here in Toronto. So please contact us or register on the website. We'd love to accommodate more people. And we also have a couple of bespoke member sessions planned for over the next month. We really are always pleased to meet with our members one-on-one, and that can be their risk groups, and that's not just second line of defense, that can be first line of defense risk managers too, as the panel just talked about, or leadership teams or boards of directors to discuss risk issues that are of importance to you. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us if we can do that with your organization. Also, in terms of thought leadership events, we have a really busy fall calendar. We have a great event coming up on October 17th on ESG investing with Randy Cohen from Harvard. On October 18th, we're doing a conduct, risk, and insurance workshop. And then in early November, a session on U.S. financial regulation with Mark Hughes and Roger Rudisilli, just to name a few. We also have a couple of great speakers lined up. Laura Dettori-Atanasio, CRO from CIBC, is the GRI speaker series at Rotman on October 29th. And Maureen Jensen from the OSC will be joining us at GRI in early November. I encourage you all to watch our website for interesting and thought-provoking opportunities to engage with the community and some thought leaders. And of course, we have a full roster of research initiatives underway, working in partnership with academics like Rob Engel and Marco Zacharidis, who you heard from today, with the NPH researchers like Mary Hardy, as well as research developed internally by Alex LaPont and her team. I would encourage you to watch your monthly Risk Pulse and Risk Focus newsletters from GRI to stay informed about what the best risk thinkers are thinking about. So we know your time is precious, and it really is with a hearty thank you that I want to say to all of you in the room, our members, our government partners, our GRI friends, thank you for spending the day with us and for your ongoing support of and commitment to GRI. But that's not all. We know in October the concept of bonuses becomes very real in people's minds, and we wanted to get in the act as GRI, so we're giving you a bonus too. And that bonus is that for those of you who can stay, my colleague, Professor Lois Tulo, Executive in Residence at GRI, has a great roundtable workshop session on emerging risks. I highly, highly encourage those who are able to stay and participate in the discussion with Lois and the really strong panel she's assembled to do so. Emerging risks and how to manage them in the context of your strategy and goals is an issue on every firm's mind that's a member of GRI. So for those of you who can't stay for the working session, this is probably your cue that the formal conference is now over. If I will start the session in about 10 more minutes, and for those of you who are staying, please come to the front so we can get a nice discussion going. And again, thank you all for coming and for a successful conference.